As you may know, in Article 2 of the Constitution, there are a couple of provisions that are outlined for the president. First, the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, will make treaties and foreign appointments. And unlike the 21st century, where we sort of expect the Senate to be either a rubber stamp or sort of a veto measure on the president, at the time, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention really expected that the Senate was going to serve as a council of foreign policy. And that might sound to us to be totally wildly nuts, but there were only 20-odd people, and they were very sort of safe advisors because they were indirectly elected, and so they could be responsible to the state legislatures and to the American people if they gave good or bad advice. So Washington really intended to use the Senate as this type of council. He visited only once, unfortunately, in August of 1789, and that meeting went very badly because he was expecting them to give immediate advice and sort of give their points of view and maybe debate about some issues and answer his questions. And they wanted to refer the issue to committee and talk about it privately and have him come back later, which he found to be wildly inefficient and not at all helpful for foreign policy. So the second option in Article 2, Section 2 says that the president may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each department on issues pertaining to their department. And this phrase was crafted really intentionally. The president was supposed to ask for written advice so that there would be a trail of evidence or a paper, sort of a paper trail to indicate who had said what and who was responsible for good and bad decisions. Americans had a deep distrust of the British cabinet, which met behind closed doors and didn't really have much transparency. And so they were really trying to preserve that sort of system when they were creating this new executive branch. So Washington also really tried to stick to this clause that was laid out for him. He sent letters back and forth with the department secretaries regularly, but then quickly discovered that that was a sort of woefully inefficient system as well, because imagine having to write out each letter with parchment and quill and then wait for it to dry and then wait for that to be delivered and then wait for the response to be written out and for it to dry and for it to be delivered. And then what happens if you have follow-up questions or you forgot to say something? We all know with email and text messages today that sometimes things get lost in translation or the tone isn't particularly clear, or maybe you have a second thought and you end up with these giant email chains. So now imagine doing that with the actual paper. And he just found it to be way too frustrating and cumbersome for the really huge tasks and decisions that were facing him as the first president. So what he started doing was asking for, after an exchange of letters, he would ask the secretaries to come and meet with him one-on-one for an individual consultation in his private study. And this is probably what his private study would have looked like in Philadelphia, which is where he spent most of his presidency. So that worked for about 2.5 years. And it wasn't until November 26, 1791, that Washington actually convened the first cabinet meeting. And that date is really essential because most people think that the cabinet was there from day one, and it really wasn't. It was very much the response, an organic response to the challenges and the difficult choices that Washington had to make. And he created the institution to provide the support and the advice that he felt he needed to handle these huge issues. So once he decided that he was going to create a cabinet, he then had to figure out how it was actually going to work, because there hadn't been one before. He certainly didn't want to go off of the British cabinet as a model, and he didn't want to use the councils at the state level as a model either. So instead, he really relied on his council of war practices from the Revolution. And he did so in a number of ways. He used the same strategies to manage these sometimes very boisterous and colorful personalities. He would send out a list of questions ahead of time and ask for them to discuss these questions once they actually got to the meeting, use it as a sort of agenda. Then he would, if the officers disagreed, which was frankly more often than not, he would ask for a written opinion afterwards to make sure he had heard from everyone to make sure that he understood what they were trying to say, and to allow himself to study all the details and the facts before making a decision sort of slowly and in his own time. He used councils of war before making any sort of big strategic decision, before ordering a retreat, which was potentially controversial, and to build consensus among the officers. So he used all of these same strategies and really the same purposes for the cabinet as well. They provided political cover, he tried to build sort of unity and consensus, and of course they provided advice and assistance. But there are actually more parallels between the councils of war and the presidency, and some of these parallels I think we'll see continue to ripple into the 20th and 21st century. Washington really considered his secretaries to be part of his official family. And so he would host regular events. He would ask them to go riding with him. He would ask them to the theater. They had dinners together. They drank tea together. And every week on Thursday, he would hold a state dinner where he would invite visiting dignitaries, diplomats, justices from the Supreme Court, congressmen, local businessmen, and usually the secretaries were in attendance either as guests or as sort of unofficial hosts as well, because Washington didn't always want to be the center of attention, and he didn't always want to be responsible for the toast and the conversation. And Hamilton in particular could always be counted on to have something to say. So he was a very helpful person to have at the dinner party. Similarly, every Friday, Martha would host a drawing room, and these events were really critical to Washington's governance because he was not the host, Martha was the host. And so he was just there as a private citizen. And because women were present, it was technically not considered a political event. It was a semi-private, semi-public event, and because women were present, politics was not supposed to be discussed. Now, of course, that was complete rubbish, and women had just as much to say about politics then as they do now, and we know politics were discussed. But because they were there, Washington was able to use these events as an opportunity to sort of walk up to senators and say, this is really what I would like you to do on this particular bill. And he wasn't accused of improper politicking or interfering with congressional affairs because it was a private event. So I think that this legacy of Washington's official family and his advisors is a really important one. The cabinet is not in the Constitution. After Washington created it, it was never codified into law in terms of governing how it should meet and how they should interact. And because Washington actually moved away from cabinet meetings later on in his presidency, he left a legacy that each president gets to decide who their closest advisors are going to be, how they're going to interact with them, when they're going to ask for advice and support. And those relationships, whether they're with the department secretaries or the vice president or friends or family members or businessmen or scientists, those relationships are really outside the purview of public or congressional oversight, which sometimes can be really, really great and sometimes can be really, really terrible. And so that sort of flexibility is the big question every time someone new comes into office. So I don't want to take up any more of my time because I want us to make sure we have a good window for conversation, but I did want to mention, Paula was nice enough to mention my book, and I know that there is a link to the bookshop either in the email or in the Zoom chat, but because unfortunately we can't meet in person and I can't sign these for you, I have created a book plate which looks like this. And there's a hound on it because George Washington was the creator of the American foxhound. And I actually, I didn't know this at the time when I rescued him, but I have an American foxhound. So in honor of both of our loves of foxhounds, I put a little hound on it. So if you go to this link, you can input your information and I will send you a personalized book plate to thank you for being here and for your interest in Washington and the cabinet.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you for, I was remiss in not pointing out the link to the book sales beforehand, but both books are for sale through a link that's on the History Author Talk website. And Roger, if you want to put it in the chat, that would probably be helpful to folks as well. Our next speaker is Joseph Esposito. Joe is a historian, a writer, and an educator. He served in 3 presidential administrations, so he's probably seen other things from his own perspective in addition to studying them. And most recently was Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs at the US Department of Education. He also held various positions over 11 years at the US Agency for International Development, and has taught history at 3 colleges, and is currently an adjunct associate professor at Northern Virginia Community College, which hopefully he could do in person in some way later this year. He received his undergraduate degree in history from Penn State and has a little handful of master's degrees from Penn State, as well as George Mason, Georgetown, University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Virginia, and has done doctoral work at American University. When I read this book, I felt truly transported to April 29th, 1962, the day of this dinner that he's going to be talking about. A reviewer said, Esposito's approach captures all of that remarkable evening's many dimensions, reading like a melding of American heritage, Architectural Digest, and Gourmet, along with a national newspaper's page 1 above the fold and the society pages. So thanks again, Joe, for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Paula, and I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. And I'd like to say at the outset that 60 years ago today, Senator John F. Kennedy was nominated for president at the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles. In his acceptance speech, he mentioned the new frontier for the first time. I met John F. Kennedy when I was a boy, right before the election in 1960. And we had a conversation. It was great. He inspired me to public service. And he said, don't forget to write that book. I want to talk a little bit about the Nobel Dinner. It really epitomized presidential leadership. It showed a sense of an understanding of symbolism, appreciation for the promotion of science, culture, and also the value of inspiration and aspiration within the presidency. As Paula mentioned, the dinner took place on April 29th, 1962. It was a balmy Sunday evening, first day of daylight savings time. It was nearly the midpoint of the Kennedy administration, and it was a highlight of a high point really of Camelot. There were 175 guests, including the president and first lady. It was the largest dinner of the Kennedy era. And honored that night were 49 Nobel Prize winners. And these people just really embraced the entire spectrum of human achievement in medicine, of course, in physics, chemistry, literature, and peacemaking. And there were 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners there. But interestingly, there were many non-Nobel Prize winners present. They were distinguished scientists, writers, scholars. Really, the guest list was a who's who of American intellectuals at mid-century. Now, most people, when they hear of this dinner, they remember one thing, and that is this memorable line, and that is, quote, I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever been gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. Well, interestingly, great quip, but interestingly, Jefferson rarely dined alone. He was very, very sociable, and he actually had a running tally of the people who had been to dinner at the White House, members of the diplomatic corps, members of Congress, and others. The dinner came shortly after Mrs. Kennedy's a famous tour of the White House. It was on Valentine's Day in 1962, and this is really showcased her restoration work in the building. Did a lot of work, especially in the Blue Room, but elsewhere as well. For this event, which drew a wide viewership, she received an honorary Emmy. So this was, again, as I say, a rollout of some of the changes that she had undertaken in the past year. Many people were involved with the dinner. Certainly, Jackie Kennedy was. She was a hands-on administrator for these events, for the guest list, but also she did a postmortem at the end of these dinners to see what went wrong, what went right. Another person vitally involved was Tish Baldridge. Tish Baldridge, the doyen of decorum, was the social secretary, and she was engaged in all aspects, and she would have these meetings to discuss progress. And one of the people who would attend the meeting would be the executive chef, Rene Verdun. Rene Verdun was a skilled culinary master, but he was born in France, and he perhaps didn't have the greatest grasp of some of American idioms. And Tish Baldridge would refer repeatedly at these meetings to the brains dinner. And he was very worried because he thought perhaps that they were going to be, he was going to be preparing brains for the main course. Fortunately, it was not the case. It was beef Wellington, and it was a notable feast. When Verdun took over as chef at the White House, it was big news. And in fact, his first event, which was a luncheon for Harold Macmillan the previous year, was actually front page coverage in the New York Times, including a photograph. There were other people involved with the planning of the dinner. Arthur Schlesinger was, and Richard Goodwin. Richard Goodwin, 30-year-old brilliant lawyer who had worked in the Kennedy campaign, had been involved with the Alliance for Progress, and it was actually he who came up with the idea of having this Nobel Prize dinner. In November of 1961, he sent a memo to the First Lady and said, how about we continue our practice of having these special meals highlighting art and culture and intellectuals by having a special event for Nobel Prize winners, recognizing that the bulk of these Nobel winners among the Americans were scientists. And so that's how the ball got rolling. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the prominent people at the dinner. The most controversial were Linus Pauling and J. Robert Oppenheimer. Pauling, who had won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1954, was very much of a peace activist. He and his wife, Ava Helen Pauling. And in fact, they were picketing President Kennedy before the dinner, the day before and that afternoon. And he had sent a number of letters to President Kennedy, very critical. The purpose, his concern was lack of progress on nuclear talks with the Russians. Ava Helen Pauling, his wife, also had sent a rather strident letter to Mrs. Kennedy only a few weeks before. People were very much concerned, interested in knowing what would take place when Pauling, the picketer, would meet up with President Kennedy in the reception line. And so when that happened, President Kennedy said, well, Dr. Pauling, I see you've been around the White House a few times. And he said, he continued to say that, well, I hope you'll continue to express your opinions. Pauling was delighted, of course. He got a lot of attention. He was front page news because there was a protester who was having dinner with the president. And he got a lot of mileage out of it. In fact, he and his wife, Ava Helen, always Ava Helen, they enjoyed themselves immensely. And they led the impromptu dancing that night to the strolling strings. There was no dancing that hadn't been anticipated. The other controversial figure, perhaps even more controversial, was J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. He had, for a variety of reasons, lost his security clearance in 1954 and basically was ostracized from official Washington. And it was President Kennedy who brought him back, and he faced a lot of criticism by inviting him to the White House. In fact, one conservative Republican senator said, well, maybe Alger Hiss will be next. There were a number there were two rising authors there, two rising writers who actually both came from Rockford, Connecticut. James Baldwin was living on the property of an adjacent building that Williams owned, and they got together. Baldwin had been the expatriate, as we know, had read a number of books and had become more engaged in social activism. He didn't like the Kennedys, particularly especially President Kennedy, but the meeting there, being able to be at the dinner, helped in in creating a meeting the following year on civil rights, in which he met with Kennedy and a number of civil rights activists. And there's a direct link between that meeting and President Kennedy's civil rights address in June of 1963. William Styron had not met President Kennedy previously. This was his first chance, even though Rose, his wife, had previously met the president. Styron enjoyed himself immensely. The president and Styron subsequently talked about writing. They went sailing that summer in Martha's Vineyard, and they began a relationship with Kennedy's and Styron's has lasted more than 50 years. And Rose Styron was tremendously helpful to me in writing this book. She has vivid memories of the dinner. It was a high point of, I think, of her life. And I was really gratified that she wrote the introduction to Dinner Camelot. The list of distinguished people at this dinner goes really on and on. John Glenn, was the hero of the hour. He had orbited the Earth 3 times, 2 months earlier, and he was a great magnet that night. He became great friends with Robert Kennedy. He was seated at First Lady Jackie Kennedy's table. Also seated at First Lady's table was the Canadian politician Lester Pearson. He would be elected Prime Minister of Canada the following year. He had already been Nobel Peace Prize winner for his work at the Suez Canal. Robert Frost sat at the president's table, and we all remember that he was crucial with the inauguration in 1961, first time, and had been part of the ceremonies. Frost was actually sent to the Soviet Union a few months after the dinner by President Kennedy in a cultural exchange effort, and it actually ended badly in terms of the relationship between Kennedy and Frost, largely because Frost had talked about what a great man Khrushchev was, and this came about the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The list again goes on and on. Catherine Ann Porter, who had wanted to be invited to the White House for an event, got her wish that night, and her only novel, A Ship of Fools, reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list that day. Pearl Buck was there. John Dos Passos was there. Pearl Buck actually had an interesting discussion with President Kennedy about Korea and Japan that night, and she, of course, had written quite a bit about Asia. Dr. Glenn Seaborg, who was the president's science advisor, a science advisor, but he was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, worked on the Manhattan Project, and he was actually responsible for identifying 10 chemical elements. Seated that night at President Kennedy's table were on his left Catherine Tupper Marshall, who was the widow of George Marshall, who had won the Nobel Prize for Peace because of the Marshall Plan, been Secretary of State. And seated on the other side was Mary Welsh Hemingway, the widow of Ernest Hemingway, and Hemingway himself was a Nobel Prize winner. He had died the previous year. Unfortunately, President Kennedy and Mary Hemingway had some disagreement at dinner, and she was particularly upset about his handling of the Bay of Pigs and his Cuba policy. And there's an interesting photograph in Life magazine in which he's hectoring him, and he's kind of tightening his bow tie. You can see he's uneasy about all this. In fact, after the dinner, the president called their mutual friend, Bill Walton, who was a socialite and an art connoisseur, who lived in Georgetown, and he complained about how awful Mary Hemingway was. Unfortunately, Mary Hemingway was there with Bill Walton and was going to spend the night there in Georgetown, so it was a little embarrassing. Arthur Schlesinger, as I mentioned, was there. He was the in-house historian. Schlesinger was very much engaged in putting this dinner together. He sat at a table with Ava Helen Pauling. In fact, he probably worked it out so he could sit next to her, so he could complain about her activism and about her husband's picketing the president. He was the ultimate Kennedy loyalist. Well, the list really goes on, and there's so many people, and I couldn't really highlight everybody, so I identified half a dozen or so to follow intensely, and then others I also discussed. And I must say I'm very pleased that Debbie Bonds is part of our discussion here tonight, because her mother was at the dinner, and her stepfather, Walter Bratton, was a Nobel Prize winner. He and Dr. Bardeen and Dr. Shockley were awarded the Nobel Prize for the transistor. So I'm very appreciative of Debbie being here tonight. So many other interesting people we could talk about, both Nobel Prize winners as well as individuals who accomplish things in various areas, Norman Cousins, and the list, again, as I say, goes on and on. After dinner, the great actor Frederick March gave a literary performance, and he talked about, he gave excerpts from work by Sinclair Lewis, who was a Nobel laureate, by George Marshall, his 1947 Harvard commencement speech, and outlining the Marshall Plan. But the bulk of the program was devoted to Ernest Hemingway and an unpublished manuscript, which was the basis for Islands in the Stream, which was subsequently released in 1970. As the dinner was breaking up, some people went over to Georgetown for an after party at Arthur Schlesinger's house, but a very select few were invited upstairs to the second floor in the Yellow Oval Room. About a dozen people: Robert Frost, Diane and Lionel Trilling, the Styrens, and several others. And the Yellow Oval Room was a special real place for relaxation for both Kennedys. President Kennedy liked to smoke his Havana cigars, which they did that night, and Jackie liked to smoke her L&Ms. She could just relax after an event like this. And they talked about a number of things. This is where they talked about the Styrens going on a sailing adventure with the president and first lady in the summer. They talked about books with Robert Frost and with Trilling and others. So it was pretty exciting, kind of special time for these people. So I'm often asked about the significance of this and about why it took place, and why something like this hasn't happened subsequently. There was no such event before, and there was nothing after. And I think the reasons why there hasn't been a subsequent dinner like this, or such a tremendous gathering, is that it is threefold. One is that I think there's a certain sense of concern about mingling too comfortably with eggheads. There's this tradition of anti-intellectualism in American life that Robert Hofstadter wrote about. But I think that's a bogus issue, but probably out there. But realistically, I think it's because in some ways we moved on from respecting and honoring achievement at the highest level, scientists and writers and others who have accomplished quite a bit. And rather, you see in the decades that have followed, more of an emphasis on celebrities, on entertainers, on sports figures, and that even permeates these White House guest lists. And I think finally, President Kennedy showed particular leadership in inviting these people, in highlighting them, in offering them as, well, first of all, thanking them for their tremendous contributions in so many fields. Some were immigrants, some were fleeing tyranny from their countries in Asia and in Europe. But he was also trying to inspire young people in this hemisphere. He understood the importance of symbolism, understood the importance of civility, and civility in terms of Linus Pauling, conciliation, perhaps with Pauling, but certainly with Robert Oppenheimer. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from this dinner. Even 58 years later, it tells us something about presidential leadership. Carl Sandburg, who declined because of another commitment, has nevertheless said that it was an event of a lifetime. And it really could be argued that this was the most significant dinner at the White House in the 20th century, or even the dinner of the century, or as one reviewer identified it, the greatest dinner party of all time. So that's an overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was great. Again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them. And I'll just start with a few that we've already received. I'm going to ask you, Lindsey, about, I guess, the elephant, or I should say the Hamilton in the room right now. That little play that a few million people have seen. How does that reflect, particularly the part when he is in the cabinet, how does that reflect, what really happened, based on your own research? Okay, we're not hearing you, actually.
There we go. How about now?
Yep, perfect.
Great. I think that it's really important to first acknowledge that it is, extraordinary art. I am a huge fan. You can't see it, but I actually have on my other wall an art that has some of the lyrics. So I can't say enough good things about it from a theater and art perspective. And I think most people are really able to understand it as just that. They know that it's not intended to be perfectly accurate history. And most people ask me just that exact question, what was real and what wasn't? And obvious things like, of course, George Washington was not a black man. So there are some casting changes. But in terms of the cabinet, while certainly they were not rapping, he does a wonderful job. Lin-Manuel Miranda does an incredible job of capturing the really contentious spirit of the cabinet discussions. In 1810, so many years after he had retired as Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson referred to the cabinet discussions as cockfight, which brings to mind just an incredibly bloody, visceral experience. And so, while it wasn't in rap, it was certainly a very combative debate. I will say the cabinet meeting number 1 was not actually in person. As I mentioned, the cabinet didn't exist in 1790, so that would have been all through written correspondence. But cabinet meeting number 2 certainly did happen in person. There were about 51 meetings that year. So there would have been many, many such occasions like that. But I also think that in terms of while we're sort of recognizing the impact of art and its relationship to the presidency, it's a great opportunity to recognize how art and music can ask us to think about history and how we study it, how we consider it, how we remember people. And in that way, I think that Hamilton has been an extraordinary gift because it has inspired so many people to want to learn more. And really, I think that, tying it into Joe's work, I think that's what celebrating authors and scholars and scientists is all about, is you want to bring their work to more of the American public. And so there's kind of a really interesting overlap there.
Great, thank you. And Joe, kind of speaking, I guess, of sort of Broadway / politics, Camelot, just tell us a little bit about, how that came to be, how that word now characterizes the presidency.
As I mentioned at the outset, President Kennedy used the term "the new frontier" in his acceptance speech at the Los Angeles Coliseum in 1960. So the term that was used to identify the Kennedy years during his lifetime was the new frontier. 1 week after his death, Jackie Kennedy had said to Bobby, I want to talk to somebody about Jack. And so they they kind of deputized Theodore H. White, Teddy White, to come up to Hyannisport and do this interview. And he arranged for the interview to be published in Life magazine. So again, this is 1 week after President Kennedy's death. And for several hours, she talked about the years in the White House, the 1,036 days. And she introduced the idea of Camelot. She said that Jack would like to listen to the record, and it reminded her of King Arthur, and she was the one who drew the connection. Mm-hmm. So I've gone through and looked at the handwritten notes of Teddy White, who actually once interviewed me for something, and so I felt a certain kinship. But White's handwritten notes, he wrote feverishly, page after page. He's taking down this incredible story, and he phones it in, and she's given some sort of editorial license to be able to make revisions. And on December 6th, 1963, the article was published in Life magazine, and it's the first reference to Camelot, and that's how it all came about.
Interesting. We have a question from one of the folks in the room for Lindsey. On what basis did Washington select his cabinet? Were they a team of rivals, or was Washington looking for something else when he chose those particular men for the jobs?
It's a great question. So there were really three primary factors that Washington considered when he was making his cabinet appointments, but also appointments to other high office. So the first was that they had to be men of experience and knowledge and expertise, and they had to have some sort of knowledge base that was different than his own. Washington understood that one person could not possibly be expected to know everything and have all of the skills and experience that were required to run a nation as large and diverse and different as, at that point, the 13 states and what it would grow to be. And so while, of course, the original secretaries were all white men, they did have a lot of really important differences in terms of their background, their religion, their education, sort of what economic factions they supported. Hamilton was, of course, pro-trade and pro-merchant and pro-city, whereas Jefferson was a plantation-owning Virginian who favored American farmers. And so they had a real diversity in sort of their outlook about what the nation should be. And the second factor was that Washington had to know them. He had to have some sort of relationship with them, which makes sense because if you're going to ask someone for advice, you want to at least trust it a little bit. And then the final thing was that, I smooshed together two. So one is that they had to represent different factions, and then one is that they had to have this experience and this expertise. And those three things, the diversity, the experience and knowledge, and then the personal relationship, are factors that have really guided most presidents since Washington. Of course, our definition of diversity has expanded to include race and gender and religion and sexual orientation and every kind of background you can imagine. And I would argue rightfully so, because it is an opportunity for a president to bring together the nation, to allow people to feel like they are represented and their voice and their perspective is heard in the administration. And that is an opportunity that presidents usually don't want to pass up, because it's a great way to build goodwill, especially in the beginning of the administration. In terms of the team of rivals concept, so while I am a huge fan of the Team of Rivals book, the kind of amazing thing is that up until Lincoln, that was pretty much the norm. Most presidents appointed the sort of leading people in their party, which meant that they were going to be squabbling over who was going to be the president's successor. This was certainly true in, for example, James Monroe's administration, where John Quincy Adams and Calhoun were sort of constantly fighting about who was going to pick up the mantle for the Democratic Party at that point. And Washington didn't really intend to create a team of rivals, but it was sort of inevitable in that he wanted to have these different perspectives. And so he understood that that was kind of going to be an inevitability.
Right, interesting. Here's a question for you, Joe, that given the current climate, given like if you even wanted to put together a gathering like this, like how do you think we could get to the point of creating it? I guess having a really good Rolodex might be a start, but.
I think it would be challenging, obviously. I think, first of all, you would have to, it would be essential to have the White House staff, which has an outreach to various sectors. In the Kennedy White House, Arthur Schlesinger was kind of the in-house liberal. He kept tabs with historians and other people. There were others who had connections with people in the arts. So the White House, the presidency is this bully pulpit, and the bully pulpit, I think, should and can include emphasizing the arts, culture, science, especially science these days, and various intellectual endeavors. And if you make a concerted effort to reach out to people, there could be an opportunity for ongoing relationships where people come in. You know, the great thing about the Kennedy administration, in addition to the Nobel Dinner, there were many such events. Pablo Casal's at the White House, first time he had performed at the White House since Teddy Roosevelt. There were, Jerome Robbins was at the White House performing with his troupe. Isaac Stern, many distinguished Americans, and Jackie Kennedy wanted to elevate this. And so I guess basically the answer to that question is you want to have the will within the White House to be able to have this kind of outreach and to really represent the American people, but also to present these distinguished people to the country and to highlight their performances. There was essentially a salon that had been created during the Kennedy years, and it was the White House was not noted for its cultural achievements in the Eisenhower administration, and I give a tremendous amount of credit to Jackie Kennedy for a number of things that she did, but notably bringing the arts and culture into the White House.
So you're saying it was America's, it was the White House's, was used as a platform for Jackie Kennedy and the reality show America's Got Talent.
Well,
sorry about that. I just had to throw that in there. Yeah. Go ahead, Paula.
It's a little different.
Actually, Lindsey, you had a line in your book, deference did not restrain their conversations, in terms of the cabinet and how they spoke with Washington. And so here's a question for both authors is, why is it important to consider and study who presidents have around them? Maybe I'll start with you, Lindsey.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, if I were president, you can pretty much call anyone in the world and they're going to pick up your phone call. That is an extraordinary right and opportunity, and the knowledge that is possible and the experiences that are available to you with that position are unparalleled. And so for me, to use a line from both Hamilton and the West Wing, I want there to be a mind at work in the office. I don't expect the president to know everything, to have all the answers. I want someone who is seeking out information from others who have studied subjects deeply. I want them to say, I want the president to surround himself with people who are willing to tell him or her when they get it wrong. And I think that's the only way you have good leadership, is they need to surround themselves with people who will push back and provide different ideas. And so that's really why I think both of these stories are sort of similar and overlap in some ways, is that we want presidents who are willing to hear from people who disagree with them and to learn from that, and to be willing to take their ideas and make something of it. That has been the example of best leaders, whether it's Washington or Lincoln or FDR. The people who are willing to hear from others are the ones that generally do the best job.
Okay.
Well, the presidency has enormous responsibility. The president we've for years identified the president as the leader of the free world, and in challenging times, other nations have looked at the United States, but of course there's the responsibility within this country as well. So you need a president who's engaged, who's knowledgeable, who gets the best advice that he possibly can get. In the case of President Kennedy, I was just reading an article the other day, an assessment of his mind. Kennedy's Mind, I think, was the title. It was in the New Republic of May 1961. So he had just taken office, and the person who wrote the article, is an incisive article, said that the thing that impressed him most about President Kennedy was his curiosity. That he was an avid reader. He absorbed information. He liked to get information from many different sources. We know from like Chris Whipple's book and others about the chiefs of staff, how important they've become over the years. But Kennedy had no chief of staff. He had a kind of spoke of a wheel kind of approach, and he had people who would come to him and present different points of view, and he was confident, he was secure that he could make good decisions by getting input from a number of people who were really the best in their field. Now, we've kind of scoffed at this term, the best and the brightest, but he had some really outstanding individuals working there, McGeorge Bundy, Robert McNamara, Schlesinger, and Dick Goodwin. There were many. So he knew how to get the best use of people who were really the best minds, and that's critical, I think.
Yeah. Do you think that, going back to the influence of Jackie Kennedy and her role in the arts, now we have obviously the Kennedy Center, and we have the Kennedy Center honors and things like that. I mean, how, I'm sort of forgetting my chronology to know if she were still, I know she was alive for the Kennedy Center, but Kennedy Center honors, I mean, what role did she have, or did that kind of influence of that dinner maybe have on some of the kind of cultural events that we, have even today?
Well, I think it set a tone, and some presidents did a better job than others. I don't think anybody has come quite as close to what the Kennedys did, but I was tremendously impressed the more research I did. I mean, with Jackie Kennedy and her career, there was, of course, the glamour, but she was a serious character. She studied, French literature. She had a good grasp, outstanding grasp of art, and she really wanted to make sure that the White House was a living museum, and that it reflected the great traditions of America. She had this, fine arts committee that she created. She launched the White House Historical Association. She was very much involved with Washington preservation. She subsequently got involved with preservation at preventing the Grand Central Terminal from being the victim of a wrecking ball. And then, really, some people don't realize what a tremendous career she had for 25 years as an editor at Viking and at Doubleday. So she had a very impressive career. She gave a lot of impetus to a different sense of Washington and the White House. And really, if you look at it, the two first ladies of the 20th century who were most influential but significant in different ways were Eleanor Roosevelt and Jackie Kennedy.
Yeah. This is going to be our last question since we're kind of nearing the hour. I'm going to ask Lindsey. As I understand it, you've kind of worked on this, this sort of grew out of your dissertation research. I mean, you've been living with these people for a long time. And I'm just wondering if, just any kind of really sort of aha moment that really kind of just got you to a whole different place in terms of your understanding of, whether George Washington or the kind of concept of his cabinet, or really what sort of, stands out as you kind of look at your sort of pursuit, I guess.
Sure. Well, I originally came to this project because I was looking for something to read about the origins of the cabinet, and I couldn't find anything. And the last book that was published was in 1910 and talked about the legislation that created each department. And so I felt this incredible amount of good luck that I came across this subject that I think people just assumed had already been talked about, and they hadn't. And so once I decided to write it, I spent basically the next 8 years hoping no one would beat me to it, which I was fortunate that they didn't. But in the process of studying Washington's cabinet and then looking at his successors as a way to kind of gauge what precedents and legacy he established, I've become so convinced that the cabinet is a really underappreciated way of studying presidents and their leadership abilities, because managing the type of personalities and egos and ambitions that are typically present in a cabinet is an almost impossible task. And it takes a very skilled manager of men and women to be able to hold all of those people together, pursuing their various goals, and all sort of working towards one administrative aim. And more often than not, that goes badly. And so I have become just so convinced that it's such a fascinating way to see how presidents interact with their subordinates and are able to use these people to advocate policies or pursue liaisons with Congress or on the international stage. And so I haven't quite gotten cabinets out of my system. I'm going to be on some other cabinets for a while.
That could be interesting, and everyone will see what cabinets come ahead. I'm going to turn it over to Roger. Yeah. I want to, again, this has been great. I've just learned so much from both your books and from this conversation. And Roger, to our host, take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lindsey. Marvelous book. I am a Revolutionary War historian, and I learned so much from what you wrote about in your book, and I really appreciate all.
Thank you.
I really appreciate all the research, and it's a great read for anybody. So I certainly appreciate that. And Joe, Joseph Esposito's book is something that's I've been working on for a long time. Full disclosure, I'm Joseph's a literary agent. So and I've really enjoyed working with such a fascinating small slice of history. I think it's terrific. As a bookman myself, I'm always fascinated by everybody's libraries. With this Zoom world, we look at everybody's bookshelves. So while our guests have been sitting here talking, I'm sitting here doing inventory on what's on their bookshelves. But the point is that we owe a lot to these scholars, these authors, who have given us such rich stories for us to learn about our history. And I think one of the things that with both Lindsey and Joseph's books, we've learned about history that is relevant to what we're living with day to day. So with that, I want to again say thank you to both of my guests, to Paula, who always does a terrific job doing this. If you go to historyauthortalks.com, you'll see the link to the bookshop where you can purchase our authors' books and other books on White House history. If you want to send me any message, you can just go to the contact tab and give me whatever feedback you have. And I hope to see you again on historyauthortalks.com. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye now.